they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. That maxim holds true for many of those who help bring about what they think is going to be a utopia for everyone. Because they are so naive and disbelieving in the fact that there are people who can pretend so well, act so well, that they care at the top of this tree, but who actually want to eliminate a good part of the planet. Now, Arthur C. Clarke, that I've mentioned a few times, who wrote a sort of scenario out in allegorical form of the system, beginning for 2001, to kick it all off, big time, the next big push, 2010 for the completion of most of it. But then he takes you in his book, his last one, 3001, through a journey into a future where they're down to 1 billion people on the planet. And even then in the book, one of the characters is complaining that's too many. It is a chip society. It also has the direct thought-to-thought control, electronic equipment working, which we know was discussed at Loyola University with a brain implant for control purposes. These guys don't make this stuff up. They're given the facts of the plan and they write stories around them which fascinate young people. Everyone is fascinated when they're young in science fiction. It's predictive programming, so that when it actually comes into being in your lifetime, because it's familiar to you, you accept it without question. It's a normal progression. We are up against pretty well everything that you take for granted. All of the agencies and organizations which you hear mentioned briefly on little news clips are non-governmental organizations. Unelected people and representatives from these organizations run your lives. From all sources, mainly from media and marketing, because marketing is one of the biggest tools they must use in conjunction with television and all advertising. They market ideas to us continuously all the time. We also have secrecy under the guise of national and international security on advanced technologies. Therefore, the public are never told, never, ever, ever told what they actually have until 50 to 80 years later. Then it's obsolete, in fact, when the public get to use it. They've moved on to much more advanced technology by then. There are 3 levels of technology in use at all times. There's the professorship down level, who believe everything they're told, and the public believes everything they read in the science magazines. They're just starting to work on something, and maybe one day in the future they will be able to, and so on. Then there's the CIA, Mossad, MI6 level, where they have advanced gadgetry. In the 1950s, Nick Bigage has shown us the CIA had technology which could put direct voice to skull information right into your middle of your head from line of sight, and you could put the gadget in your pocket. Antique stuff by today's standards. The whole flying saucer scenario covered up the government making the darn things by getting the media to go into action and even fronting groups to start up the whole alien thing. Well, it must be from the aliens because we don't have them. That's how easy it was to divert attention from black budget projects. Remember, there's always a good reason given to the public. Then there's a real reason which they're never told about. That's how you manage the public. That's what Francis Bacon and Machiavelli and other advisors to kings and queens talked about. It's best not to let the public know the real purpose behind laws and institutions and movements. As I say, you don't want to frighten the children, and that's how we are looked upon. Now, there's too many children, according to them, and we don't have a function anymore, and we might get unruly, in fact, if we don't have enough bread in circuses, like Mr. Huxley talked about. And they plan to deal with it all as they bring this world down. As it's uniting, we're going into the horror show. We're not all happy, smiling faces. We're going into economic depressions. Our whole life is to be regulated. All energy resources have been taken from our hands completely. And shortly it will be banned if you try and heat yourself to live and survive in a winter, unless you use their designated fuel, and if you have your place inspected to see if it's fit to use this fuel. This has happened already here in Canada. You'll probably be hung, drawn and quartered if you try and use wood in a wood stove, because you'll be independent of the monetary system, the profit system, which keeps you, or will keep you, in grinding poverty. You're going to be taxed for every BTU you use. You're going to pay through the nose for every little watt of electricity. And you're going to be trained now. The UN says we must be trained. We must train the public to cut back and back and back. And as they're training us to cut back the cost of electricity, and all power is to vastly increase. The global plantation is underway. The food resources of the world are out of the public's hands in most countries. What's left for the public is modified by scientists who worked in secret agreements with governments, admitted now. And these are the same boys who are bringing us in to a lovely world order where we're supposed to march in with balloons and skipping and hopping gaily, if you can still use that word, gaily, like naive little children, as the Pied Piper leads us to utopia, which is actually Dante's Inferno. Big shock to people who think their countries have just been taken over now. Big shock. Terror, hype, fear to think you've just been taken over. You were born in a time when it really was already taken over. In the book I just read, they talked about the precursor and a setting up of a system which became NATO, which would link and bind and join at the hip Britain and the United States and Canada, and eventually the rest of Europe. Go into the writings of Karl Marx, who wrote his, well, it wasn't his Communist Manifesto, he just wrote what he was told. But he wrote it in London, and he was sponsored by the big foundations to do so. The richest corporations on the planet funded him to write it. And in there he said, in the 1800s, the world they'd bring into being would consist of three main trading blocks: a united Europe, the United Americas, and a Pacific Rim area, all with provincial governments, provinces, you see, under a super world government. And if you think it's still all coincidence, go back to dreamland. Follow rainbows. You might find a leprechaun at the end of it with a pot of gold. Have an out-of-body experience. Play with your chakras. Wish it all better, as we tell the children when children skin their knees. Why don't you wish it all better? Close your eyes and wish it all better. The whole New Age phenomena has disarmed the minds of millions of people. The circuses and the sports have disarmed most of the rest. They say there's nothing new under the sun. Perhaps so, except for the advance in psychology on a mass scale, coupled with such a mass media. But the techniques are old. That is true. Very old techniques that unified ancient cultures. If a moneyed system had never come into being, you would have, over a vast amount of time, gradual integration of all peoples, because young people, when their hormones work, don't really care what colour someone is at all. You'd have a natural integration without conflict over a long period of time. It's happened in other countries too. When the Scots came into Scotland, the Picts already lived there, and there's no records of wars. There was intermarriage, and gradually they were assimilated into the Scots. That's happened in many other countries too. It's only when there's money behind it, because they have an imperative of time running it towards business plans as they do, that they bring in brute force and force things along. Or they use and pay for massive immigration to come in to create conflict. When people come in small numbers to any country, they gradually blend in, mix, adapt. The policies of putting people in specific areas in large cities is a form of ghetto creation to keep them separate. It doesn't help them disperse and integrate into the system. Because one day, you see, they can always use that conflict when it suits them. And that day will come when they start crashing the moneyed system. Everyone can get along just, you see, in crowded cities, as long as the money's flowing for everything. When it starts to get difficult to pay the rent, everyone's worried, conflicts begin, and people start subdividing back into original groups and fighting each other. The big boys count on these kind of things happening to bring in the brute force for the new system. So don't fight each other. We've got to rise above all of that. And don't let good speakers stir up the emotions to such a pitch that the ordinary folk fight the other ordinary folk, regardless of their colour, creed, or whatever. That's what they count on too, you see. When you see the big picture, I see the populations of the world facing the same horror show, a non-thinking future for what will be left of what they call, or we call, humanity at the lower levels, which is the majority. A state of never being able to say, I think. It will be inconceivable to perceive of yourself as a distinct individual, as we've been told. The book I quoted from, I'm sure even that was whitewashed to an extent, but it does at least show you all the groups, the left and right, all the people who went back home and claimed they were for the working peoples. And the lords were there too, different lords, and they go back there and talk to their own peer group and have a little chuckle how they'd conned the public again, or the people, and how I had them all on board, you see, on board and on track.